Today's training is on time off accruals, understanding the accrual basics. We do have a next step accrual training that you can take after you went through this process, but for today we're just going to really touch on the basics and go over some of the different areas. There is only a couple individuals on this call today, so please mute your phones. I am not going to mute you. I'll allow you to, at any time, just ask me any questions. Okay, the topics we're going to cover today, we're going to cover understanding the accrual tab fields, the order of accruals, how do frequencies work. We're going to set up a frequency-based accrual, and we're going to set up a per hour. So there'll be exercises at the end, and then we'll talk about some helpful information. Now, I did give you a couple as far as like knowledge-based articles or web help. You can actually go to web help. You can see in here that you can get the frequencies and accruals guide, troubleshooting, and then there are some reference sheets as well. When you are actually in web help, I would recommend that at the very top, just do a search and all search on accruals, and they'll pull up everything we have on accruals in there for you. Now, some of the items that you're going to need before you even start to set up an accrual for a client is you're going to need a copy of their written policy, or they need to outline that information for you. So for the most part, this a lot of times is the most difficult part. They will sometimes not give you all the information you need, so you really have to be very thorough about reading through it, making sure you understand it, setting it up with them, and then walking them through it again so they can see how it's going to work and they can be clear on what they've communicated to you. Now, exceptions as far as when a client has some unique exception that they really are trying to achieve through the accruals. Like I have seen some clients that want to be able to say if the client worked half of the weeks in the entire month, like they at least work 2 of the 4 weeks in the month, then they get the accrual the next month. Well, there's no way for us to be able to achieve that. There's no way for the system to be able to look at that because we cannot script within the accrual. If we could script within the accrual area, we probably would be able to cover a lot of the exceptions, but since we can't, it really is and does what it does. We can't really change any of that. We can work around some little exceptions when people are trying to maybe achieve clearing different times of year in different buckets, but we really, again, exceptions can be very difficult when you're doing accrual, so just keep that in mind. And if you're not sure, just ask your somebody at MPAY. Now, you also want to make sure that you set up the earning codes that will be associated with the accrual policy. And you'll also need to set up code groups containing earnings on which the time is accrued for hourly-based accruals and sometimes reduced by for frequency-based accruals. The most common time that you're going to use code groups would be for an hourly-based accrual. Now, you also want to make sure that you have a frequency set up. And we stress we're very clear about stating to everyone that when you are setting up an accrual frequency, you want to make sure that you do not use the standard M3 frequencies. And we're going to jump over to M3 in just a few minutes, and we'll talk about that some more. That there are standard ones like the one-time and the monthly and the semi-monthly, the biweekly and weekly. Those are used for tax codes and pay frequencies within the software. So those are hard-coded behind the scene, and 90% of the time they would work fine. However, at times they do not because of the fact that they're hard-coded, looking at tax more and looking at pay frequencies. So we recommend you set a new one up and you don't use the standard ones that we have. Now, what we're going to do is I just want to touch briefly on the fact that when you are setting up a frequency, other than a weekly or biweekly, you must dictate when it's going to happen. So on the biweeklies and the weekly frequencies, they're always set to block, not when it occurs, but when it doesn't occur. And you can tell that when you actually go to set it up by the options that it gives you over here on the right-hand side. Now, the concept of a frequency, and this will help you understand it a little bit, is there's 2 main uses. They're used to define how often an event occurs, so known as a per year frequency. For example, specific events occur in a year, for example, tax and pay frequencies. So that is a how often it occurs. And they also are dictating when an event occurs, known as a per payroll frequency. So it defines whether a specific event occurs on a given payroll. For example, an accrual, a deduction frequency. Now, it's also really important to understand that when you're in Millennium and you're working with the accruals, that you need to understand that a week is defined differently than an actual calendar week. So it doesn't matter what month of the year it is. The week is outlined the exact same in Millennium. And a week is always 1 through 7 being the first week, 8 through 14 being the second, 15 through 21 the third, 22nd through 28th the fourth, and the fifth week is always the 29th through the 31st. So there are times that you need to be very conscious of that when you are trying to determine when it is going to occur, whether it's going to happen the first week or the second week based off of their calendar. Now we're going to jump over to M3 here. Give me just a moment and let me, okay. At any time, if you cannot see my screen, please say something. I'm just going to make the assumption that you can see it. All right. So over here in M3, this is where you actually will start to work and set up the accrual. Now, the first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to make sure that you have a description for the actual accrual. And I try to keep that very specific to exactly what it is. If it's vacation, if it's personal time, sick time. There are some companies that have a lot of accruals. They'll have vacation for management, maybe vacation for supervisors, and then maybe vacation for hourly employees. So just make sure that you try to set it up that your code is very specific to what you need it to be. Now, your start date is just that, when the accrual is starting. So it's just going to automatically populate when you add it. And your end date should always be forever unless it's for some reason they're setting up new accruals every year or setting up a new policy, and then you would have an end date. You have your, oops, let me jump up here. I'm sorry, I apologize. I need to be on the company level. I was on the employee. Sorry about that. Anyway, on the description is here where I said you need to be specific so that you know exactly what the accrual is trying to accomplish. And then you'll look over here and you have your accrue on. Now, this is where you would set up a code group if you were going to have an hourly accrual. And what this would do is tell the system, and we'll take a look at that. We'll look at a code group out here. And we have a code group called PTO. And so what this does is tells the system for an hourly based accrual, most of the time your employer is going to want to know what earnings to base that amount that they receive on. So they may have regular and overtime, but maybe if the employee gets vacation and sick, they're not going to use that to make the calculation. In this situation, if an employee were getting paid weekly and they had 40 regular hours and 2 hours of overtime, and they had it set up that both of these would be used to make that calculation, it would take the 42 times whatever the rate was. So that's what it's trying to achieve on an hourly based accrual. Now, there are times that you will see people use a code group to reduce by, and you'll see that on a frequency-based accrual when they're going to use it in the situation of maybe they have 2 earning codes but 1 accrual code. And so, for instance, they would have a personal time off, a PTO accrual code, but their earnings that were set up were sick and vacation. And it didn't matter which one of those codes they used. They wanted to reduce that accrual by either one of those codes. So you may have them use a code group in that situation. That's not common, but you will see it sometimes. Jump back over here to the accruals on the company level. So again, definitely want to make sure that accrue on, anytime you are using a per hour accrual, you are going to have an accrue on. When you're using a frequency-based accrual, you are only going to have a reduce by. Now in this situation, you're telling the system, what am I reducing it by? So every time what earning is used, is it going to reduce the employee's accrual? That's exactly what the reduce by accomplishes. If you're using the...
I have a quick question, Darla.
Sure.
Would there ever be both accrue on and reduce by?
I'm trying to think. Yes, absolutely. On an hourly basis, it's always going to be like that.
Okay. So it's not an either or for hourly. Okay.
Yes, on hourly, it's going to have both. Frequency is just going to have the reduce by.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So you're welcome. Sometimes where I was explaining the code groups for a frequency, sometimes the reduce by will become a code group because they may have two earnings in there that are maybe sick and personal time, but only one accrual code. So either way, if the employer uses either one of those when they're paying the employee, it would reduce either one of those if you had a code group. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the next thing you want to keep in mind and always remember is that if you have a per hour, sometimes you're going to have a minimum and a maximum. And so what this really accomplishes is it allows the employer to eliminate maybe part-time people. So you could see that if they were getting paid weekly and they only wanted people who received 35 or more hours to receive the accrual, they could put a minimum in here of 35. And then maybe they were going to pay some overtime, allow some overtime to be part of the calculation. But let's just say they wanted to stop it at 45 hours. If they populate these two fields, it would tell the system that if the employee only works 34.5 hours, anything below 35 hours, they're not going to get that accrual. And again, anything over 45, they'll get it up to the 45, but not anything over that when they're basing it on the hours they work to make the calculation. The new employee filter, I want to make sure that I'm really clear and that I explain this in detail to everybody. We do cover the new employee filter a lot more in the next step, so I would encourage you to take that if you're interested in learning more about this. But I caution you about using this if you're not clear on what it does. What this new employee filter accomplishes is you can set a filter up that will tell the system if the employee meets this specific requirements that I've set in this SQL statement. So for instance, I say all active employees and all employees who are full-time employees on their status field. It will then automatically, when I process the payroll, so when I process this next payroll, it will automatically populate and add the accrual to every one of the employees right here. So it will go in and automatically add the accrual here where you will not have to manually do it. Where I caution people, and I want to make sure they always understand this and that they're clear on this, is it automatically adds it. So you need to be very specific to your actual requirements. If I were using this, I would make sure that my SQL statement had several, per se, criteria stated in it. I may say I want them to be active, I want them to be regular full-time, and I may even set something else up so that I may have 3 statements that it has to meet all 3 before it adds it to the employee. Because once you add it to the employee, you're not going to be able to remove it. And even if you try to, it would add it again when the next payroll process as long as they met that. So if you look at this right here, you've got employee status as active. Now something that I've talked about before is that I've said if people aren't going to use this employment type here, you can go to the system level. So you can go into your master company area, miscellaneous. Oops, sorry about that. I meant to go into miscellaneous and company. And you can take a look at your employee filters. And this is where it would actually be set up. And what I did is I said to tell the system to look at an employee type called TOA. And I just created another employee type.